Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here with us today. My name is Alan Beard, and I'm the Special Assistant to the President of the Brennan Center in New York, Michael Waldman. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to reform, revitalize, and when necessary, defend the systems of democracy and justice. Our DC office is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, and for that and many other programs, we are grateful to be in partnership with the NYU John Bradamus Center and NYU's Washington, D.C. campus. Every year on Martin Luther King Day, we tend to look back on the same widely celebrated aspects of Dr. King's life: his I Have a Dream speech, his commitment to nonviolence, his calls for racial brotherhood. Rarely, however, do we grapple with the facets of King's ideology that make us uncomfortable, that make us recognize our own role in the systems of power that perpetuate poverty and armed conflict here and across the globe. Dr. King had more than just a dream of racial brotherhood. He had a dream of a nation totally transformed. By the end of his life, he was sick and tired of watching 50 million people across the nation suffer under crushing poverty. He could no longer bear seeing photographs of burned villages and dead children in Vietnam. What he wanted was to bring about a radical revolution of values, a mass awakening of consciousness that would completely restructure the architecture of American society. The shift in Dr. King's activism from civil rights to human rights is essential to understanding who he was as a person and to honoring his legacy. It's what compelled him to deliver his speech against the Vietnam War that all but destroyed his reputation. It's what drove him to launch the Poor People's Campaign. And ultimately, it's the reason he was killed. Joining us today are two people who have dedicated their lives to public service. We are very pleased to welcome former Congresswoman Donna Edwards, who served Maryland's 4th Congressional District from 2008 to 2017, and former Republican National Committee Chair Michael Steele, who served in that position from 2009 to 2011. They will be in conversation with the Brennan Center's Ted Johnson, a former commander in the U.S. Navy and former speechwriter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At this very moment, we are engaged in a great fight for the future of democracy in America. And with all the chaos that seems to fill the news cycle every day, it's easy to wonder if we'll make it through. It's easy to lose hope. But when everything Dr. King fought and died for is at risk, losing hope is simply not an option. As we approach this somber anniversary, let us recommit ourselves to the cause of protecting and strengthening democracy. May we be relentless in the pursuit of justice and seek freedom for people everywhere. And may Dr. King's life be a reminder to us all that the true greatness of America lies not in what it is, nor in what it has been, but in what it can be. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Donna Edwards, Michael Steele, and my colleague, Ted Johnson.
So thanks, Alan, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. As Alan mentioned, tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. And today was when he gave his last speech 50 years ago in Memphis, Tennessee. And so what I'd like to begin with is asking Donna and Michael about that day when they first learned that King had been killed. Both were elementary school age children at the time, and those can be pretty impressionable years. So can you just give us a sense of where you were and how you learned about the news and how it hit you?
I remember distinctly where I was. My dad was stationed at Beale Air Force Base. We lived on the installation. I had gotten out of school that day in 4th grade, and I remember being at home with my mom and hearing the news. Because we were on a military installation, our entire installation actually went on lockdown that day. And, you know, in our family, we had heard about and talked about Dr. King a lot. And I think like a lot of families, you know, Michael will probably say this too, you know, there was the church fan that had Dr. King and JFK on it, and then later a church fan with RFK on it. And that was our household. And so, and I remember being afraid. So.
Yeah, for me it was interesting. So I was on a bus here in D.C. I'm a native Washingtonian. Lived up in the Petworth community where my parents still live. And so we were on the bus coming from Julius Landsberg department store down on 7th Street, which becomes Georgia Avenue at Florida Avenue. And so we're heading up, and at a certain point, a gentleman jumped on the bus screaming, "They just killed King." And I remember sitting next to my mother, and of course there was just this explosion of emotion on the bus. And my mother, you know, did the "oh my God" kind of response, and I was like, "What's up? You know, what's wrong?" I'm a young kid, and I could see that she was very upset. And what was striking about the moment was, for the rest of that trip up Georgia Avenue, there was silence on the bus. But outside the bus, the chaos had begun. And the people out in the community were coming out of their homes, out of their businesses, and it became a very intense moment. So I get home, get in, Mom turns on the television, and we're watching this, and she's clearly upset. My father comes in about 45 minutes to an hour later, and he's upset, and he's telling my mom about the ride home coming up 14th Street. The looting and the burning had begun. The rioting had begun. And he asked my mother, "Where's the bar of soap?" And she was like, "We need a bar of soap." She said, "Because I got to put Soul Brother on the windows, otherwise they'll break the windows of the house." Wow. You know, they were coming into the neighborhoods. So you had to indicate where you stood in that moment. You were either with the black community and King, or you were not. And there were cars turned over and all that. So it was a very powerful moment. And finally, I think the moment that sort of encapsulated the whole King legacy for me as a young man was, at a certain point, my mom was tearing up. She was upset. And so whenever my mama got upset, I got upset. So I was like, "Okay, what's going on?" And she said, "A friend of the family has died." And that's always how I looked at King, as a friend of the family. Right. And I think that was, for me, one of the first and most lasting impressions about the man, and then later on learn more about the legacy.
Right. All right, it's so interesting, the Soul Brother anecdote. I hadn't heard that before, and frankly, my first memory of King, I was born a few years after his death, was in 81, 82, when they started having the debate about whether we should make his birthday a holiday. And so this was the nation's opportunity to sort of, where do you stand on King?
Right.
And there was a national conversation about this. The memory for me is Stevie Wonder's Happy Birthday song, which is like the unofficial African-American birthday song now. Right. But you know, at King's death, disapproval rate 66% or so. And yet, in the early 80s, his birthday becomes a national holiday. So his image, you know, the nation reimagined who King was in the interim. What do you make of the person the nation made King into be in the early 80s, but certainly today, and how that differs from the King the nation watched be killed in Memphis?
Such an interesting question, because I always thought of King as a bit of a revolutionary, although in the current context, maybe not so much. But you know, you recall, and I did, although I didn't know this as a child, but later on, listening to that last speech in Memphis, and I've listened to it many, many times over, he was calling for a boycott of major companies in the United States. Right. He was calling for things that even today are viewed as very outside of the main. And I think in some ways he almost had to do that, and which is why we have to kind of remake him in a way, because he was traveling the distance between you know, the people who were rioting on the streets and using much more aggressive and violent tactics, and the relevance of his nonviolent struggle.
Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I guess as I look at my own personal journey, I've always looked at the competing interests within the black community, the competing philosophical interests within the community, and how that manifests itself politically. So you go back to the Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois debates. You go to the Malcolm X and Dr. King debate. And for me, it's an interesting philosophical journey. I've always blended the King and the X. It's freedom and peace by any means necessary. And I think for me an interesting juxtaposition why the image of King at the time of his death was so negative was the journey that he took relative to Malcolm X. At the end of X's life, he had become much more tuned into the economic and other arguments that Dr. King had been making. Whereas King had also begun to be a little bit more exercised and interested in that radicalization, that sort of in-your-face response back to the police state. And even though their deaths are separated by some 3 years, that arc overlapped.
There was a convergence of
There
the
was a
ideology.
convergence. And you can understand how, by the point King is making his last speech, that America's looking at him and going, I thought he was the good Negro. I thought he was okay. But he's calling for boycotts. He's upsetting the system. He's pushing back. I mean, I don't mind a march. Y'all can go sit down at a lunch counter. But this is something different. And that explosion really took off. That's why what happened on the day of his death is so powerful. It was the pent-up frustration, anger that he had kept a lid on, quite honestly. White folks didn't appreciate what King being in that spot meant and how he because if they just gone the full Malcolm X, it could have been riots long before 1968.
But we've always been challenged as a Black community in that conundrum, the Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And part of the reason is because sometimes the majority population has to find someone safe, someone who can speak for all of us, even though we know in our own communities that there's no one who speaks for all of us.
Right.
And at the time, King was safe until.
He wasn't.
Right, and it was a strategy, and King was very deliberate in how he approached the civil rights movement. He understood that if he had to be respectable, he had to appear comfortable to the nation, or they would have shut him down before a lot of his work got going.
Well, you saw the battle with the ministers, even within the movement.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Right, and so to your point, and then at some point, the Civil Rights Act of '64 is passed, Voting Rights Act of '65 is passed. And then it's almost as if the nation is saying, you got what you wanted, go home.
Right.
And King instead reinvented himself, or actually expanded his message. Right. And so he's killed April 4th, 1968, or I'm sorry, April 4th, 1968. But a year before that, in April of '67, is when he gives his speech on Vietnam. And he breaks a norm, a democratic norm, an American norm, really, when he chastises the United States, its leadership, its military in front of the world, which is something American leaders are supposed to, put on a good face for the world and then sort of talk shop only when you're in the company of other Americans. He took the message internationally about the role of the United States in Vietnam and how inappropriate it was, he felt, for the violence they had exacted. In his speech, he talks about, how can I talk about violence in the ghetto if I am unwilling to address the violence the United States is perpetuating around the world? And in doing so, he puts a moral imperative, he puts that on a pedestal above political expediency. He ruins relationships. So what do you think about this, of King's turn to making moral arguments, knowing he was sacrificing political capital and ruining or sabotaging relationships here in the United States for objectives he had domestically?
I think part of that is it is just the nature of the journey of the individual, the realization, the enlightenment that occurs when you're in these roles at the forefront of a movement, and we can see examples of it today, as recently as the young individuals out of Parkland that rise up and begin to speak, and you listen to the language and the attitude and the insight in the heat of the moment in the aftermath of the shooting, and then some 6 weeks later, you can see the progression of thinking, the progression of idealism in some respect, but also the progression of reality. Certain things begin to settle in, and I think for King, he's no different in the sense that he understood what the reality was. He while he's talking about the plight of the Negro in the South, he's also looking at a broader picture, and he's seeing and hearing a response from around the country and around the globe, quite frankly, about what the U.S. is doing. Right. And so while the U.S. may have its thumb on the Negro here in the South, globally, the U.S. seems to have its thumb on what's going on in Vietnam, et cetera. So he made that connection as a part of, I think, of the general course of enlightenment and the maturity of his own philosophical view about these things, and not just looking at it from the very local issue of, police brutality and racism and lynchings, but how that is translated more broadly on a global stage by the government.
I don't know. I mean, I think, if you go back and listen to Dr. King's speech, his first one in Montgomery, where he is then anointed this young leader, he talks about his root in faith and his Christianity, and that Christianity isn't anything if it's not about justice. In his last speech in Memphis, he says the same thing. In his speech in Vietnam, on Vietnam at the Riverside Church, he talks about the call for democracy and justice, and that they are twin calls that are rooted in his faith. And so I actually don't think that it was much of a stretch for him to go from the anointed civil rights leader to Vietnam.
Right.
And then on to the anti-poverty.
Yeah, but he couldn't start with Vietnam.
No, he couldn't.
He couldn't come out of the gates
not at all.
protesting the war.
But I think the roots are the same, and that's why for him, it was a transition that had to be made.
Yeah, and in fact, as you said in that Riverside speech, he said something about when we first started, we were talking about saving the soul of America. This is aligned to that same cause.
That's
right.
And so, but I guess there was at some point a mental switch flipped where he decided achieving political objectives for black people in the Deep South in America, really black people around the country, was no longer big enough for his ideas, and that the message had to expand. I'm just curious about that calculation. And I think where I think among African Americans, his approval rate had gone down in the latter years because he'd sort of gotten off message. I thought this was about black people. Now you're talking about this other international stuff, and we still haven't been saved. Did that? I don't want to ask if that seemed wise, because his message was his message. But was the sacrifice of his personal clout as the leader of the civil rights movement, was that moral calculation seemed to override the politics of the moment? And that's frankly something we don't see too often now. Was that exchange, was it timed right? Was it did he get the most out of who he was at that point in time?
I don't know, but let's think about what it led to, because if you consider the students at Parkland, they very quickly made this intersectional connection between them and Black Lives Matter, and ordinary street violence versus mass shootings. And so I think in some ways, Dr. King was actually the beginning of trying to create cross alliances, because he realized that if we only solved the problem of the Negro in America, as though that's not big enough, that doesn't solve the problem of poverty. It doesn't solve the problem of economic injustice. It doesn't solve the problem of the United States engaged in war in places where we shouldn't be. And he had to make that connection for himself, because he knew that if we didn't make those connections, then it would be really difficult to solve the basic problems of injustice for Black people in the United States.
Right.
I guess the cynic in me can't help but think also of the political calculation in some of this as well. When you go back and you listen to the Johnson tapes, President Johnson's conversations with King, you go back and you read some of the contemporaneous writings about what was going on in the movement at the time. There's also the realization that you can only go but so far, and then you're going to have to reinvent. You're going to have to choose a different path. You're going to have to figure out another course, maybe. And I think the Vietnam War as a backdrop, as a narrative, as a separate narrative, sort of aided that and sort of fed into that. Not to discount the morality and all of those particular pieces that come into it, but to do what King did and to do it the way he did it, to leverage what he had to leverage, you can't discount the political nature of the man as well.
Right.
And the astute political sense he had, the timing of it he had, and how he would play that out, recognizing that it created a lot of tensions within the civil rights movement, which within the leadership conference, the Christian Leadership Conference, because there were those who did want to focus just on the plight of African Americans in the South and other parts of the country, and let's solve that problem, Dr. King, before we go out here and try to end the Vietnam War. Right. King saw the politics, the convergence of that, as an opportunity to raise that bar, that moral bar, a little bit higher than just talking about the plight of the black man. Why is that important? Because it gets the rest of the white folks involved in the conversation.
Right.
I
mean, that's the lesson that you have to draw other allies, right? And if it were only us having a conversation with ourselves, we're not going to go very far.
And those like-minded white people at the time were like, yes, we stand with you. Meanwhile, 3/4 of the community is like, really? Why are you doing this? Right. So they're out protesting the war and not so much paying necessarily attention to what's going on here at home. It's not that they're indifferent. It's just like, okay, my son is now fighting in the Vietnam War, or my brother's been sent to this ill-gotten war, et cetera. So there's a self-interest there that he understood. So let's raise the bar. Let's connect the morality, the injustice of it all. Talk about how the government is actually playing the puppeteer here, and I think that sort of aided. That political astuteness, I think, sort of aided him in sort of making those dots connect.
Well, because I was in a military family, I actually can remember when Dr. King made that speech on Vietnam, the conversation that ensued among service members who were my dad's friends. Right. And you know what? They were totally with him because they knew what the sacrifice was. They knew what was going on. And then shortly thereafter, after Dr. King's assassination, we actually moved to the Philippines in the center of the Asia Theater. Right. And those conversations that were happening were around Dr. King's message about Vietnam. And even though they served bravely and proudly, they were not happy with the direction that the United States had taken in the course of the war.
Right, and I mean, and to that point, even though the military had been desegregated in '48, the troops were still very much segregated, particularly on the front lines. So much so that the Vietnamese would release leaflets over black troops saying, "Why are you fighting us when you should be fighting the KKK at home?" Sort of leveraging our racial divide for military purposes. But we bring up, we sort of arrived at an interesting point in King's life where he decides to expand the coalition beyond the civil rights debate and sort of the black community to a more economic argument and a multiracial kind of coalition. He says, the speech on Vietnam happened in April '67. In the summer of '67, that was the long, hot summer of '67, where 100+ riots, race riots had broken out across the country. And this is when President Johnson decides to pull the Kerner Commission together to figure out what in the world is going on here in the States. And King, though he was a nonviolent, a practitioner of the nonviolent doctrine, he says, "I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America is failing to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years." And that sort of starts off some of the rhetoric around his Poor People's Campaign, which was not just about the Negro poor, but which was about poor people writ large. He begins to tie civil rights, racial justice to economic justice. And perhaps, maybe for one of the first times where you sort of see the gains from civil rights and the Great Society legislation that don't bear themselves out economically for Black communities, but for white working class communities and white poor as well. So this expansion was almost a thing that seemed to turn him against, or the nation turned against him. And so I'm curious your thoughts on how a more inclusive message from King actually makes him more disliked across the country.
Well, I think, I've thought about this a lot because I think strategies of people who are in power are often to have folks fighting among themselves, and King talked about that, right? That, about unity and about the need for unity and the connection between the economic circumstances of rural and working class white folks with Black folks.
Right.
And that was a very powerful and dangerous message to people who had power. And I think it is actually the point at which King becomes, that his presence is more challenging to the political establishment and status quo than it ever had been.
Yeah, because now you're starting to mess with people's money.
Right. The elite money, that's right.
You don't mess with the money. I mean, okay, you can go march about, injustice, but, don't mess with my bankroll.
And also, it's a bigger coalition, right?
Well,
I mean, you're uniting,
right.
working class and rural white folks with Black folks.
Right.
That is a much more powerful alliance than standing alone. And King recognized that. And I think that, if you, go back and look, that's the point at which, there is just more investigation and activity from the FBI, more calling into question his motives. All of that begins to happen when he makes that connection.
Right, because again, you start to mess with the money, and you're getting employees and those who want to be employed riled up about that. What is interesting about that argument for me, just to bring it forward and connect the dot? So back last month, around the 18th of March, you had the shooting in Sacramento. Stephon Carter, I believe.
Stephon Clark.
Clark, right. And I listened to the argument, to use that term, at the council meeting. They had the public meeting where the mayor spoke, and his brother spoke on behalf of the family and Stephon. And it was interesting, the argument he made. He wasn't railing about the brutality of the act of the police in his grandmother's front yard, the shooting of another unarmed African-American male. What he argued about was the condition of the Black community, the economic plight that African-Americans in this community find themselves in to this day, which I was thinking back to King beginning to make that argument in a very powerful way about not just the civil rights, but the economic rights of the American people, specifically African Americans. And it'll be interesting to see how that recognition plays itself out now as one of the root causes of the condition of how you look at the Black community, in poverty, uneducated or miseducated, et cetera, and how that plays into the stereotype of young Black men as criminals, as somehow dangerous, et cetera. I just thought that connection of the economic piece, again, not arguing about the violence, because that was self-evident and speaks to itself, but then tying it into the general condition of the community as a whole.
Right.
I thought was very interesting.
Absolutely, and so King saw this as a systemic issue, and a lot of the issue we're having around this debate today is who's responsible for the crime we see in Black communities or for the deaths of these unarmed Black men and Black women. And the idea is that if they're poor because of some personal default, They're subject to police violence because of the disrepair in their communities. That's partially their fault because they haven't cared for them. They don't work hard. So it's almost it's a personal indictment of Black people instead of a recognition of what the system, sort of the condition that it's placed Black folks in. We've just seen, last month was 50 years since the Kerner Commission report was released, and then 5 years ago was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And tons of reports have come out around these anniversaries and have talked about how housing segregation, school segregation in the 60s looks a lot like it does today, and how the disparity for Black unemployment in the 60s between Black unemployment and white unemployment looks a lot like it does today, and how wage discrepancies are still existing. And so it's a lot of these articles, research is showing that not only has King's dream not been realized, but we haven't even made real progress on closing the gap between Black America and the rest of the country, and a lot of that is an economic argument. So looking forward, what is and particularly what the parties are arguing today, what is the message for Black America? A lot of politicians like to claim King's message of, he wanted a colorblind society. He said he didn't want to be judged by the color of his skin, but content of their character. As if to say he didn't want anyone to see race anymore. So colorblind policy, rising tide lifts all boats, sorts of policy is the right way to help the Black community. Yeah, but which is inaccurate naturally.
Look, the truth of a rising tide, and I count myself as a acolyte of Jack Kemp from the economic empowerment wing of the GOP, but the truth of a rising tide lifting all boats is that you got to have a boat first.
Period. That's it.
So when the tide of prosperity comes in, you get to rise with it. You don't drown.
Right.
And I think a lot of what you see happening is through policy after policy, talking point after talking point, is a continual drowning. There is not a systemic rising of the boats.
Right. Yet the policy was built for boat owners.
Right.
But I mean, we also have to acknowledge, though, that there's been an intentional disinvestment in communities that prevents that tide from rising, prevents those boats from rising. If you look in urban communities, what you see is over the last 40 years, direct disinvestment in those communities. And you can't expect a community to rise on its own, that it's got to have some help. And I think that, whether you're talking about social services or schools or even political representation,
But we've had the political, let's just keep it real. We've had the political representation. That representation has done jack.
Well, I don't know that I'd argue that Black folks on the ground have had political representation.
Well, I look at the state legislatures and they look there are a whole lot of Black folks in there representing a whole lot of Black people. So the reality of it is, it's a two-way street of responsibility. And so we can look, and that's why at this point, I kind of look at having been inside the political beast for a significant portion of my life, knowing very well how it operates, and to your point about its lack of interest on both sides of the aisles, quite honestly, about the economic and other situations within any community, let alone a Black community, that's not tied to economic self-interest, all right, they're not there to help you. They're just not. And I think we need to be honest about that. When if you get up every day and you take your kid into a failing school as a parent, at what point do you say, I've had enough of this? If you live in a neighborhood in which every night you have to go hide in a bathtub to avoid bullets flying throughout the community, at what point do you have to say enough? And so the question I think that King presses on us is, at what point do you engage and do you protest and say enough is enough? That's why people are sort of shocked, shell-shocked, honestly, about the response by these young people in Parkland. That was an immediate pushback in your face. We're going to take you down on this issue because you're killing our own. All right, we've had enough. I mean, think about it, people. You had 20 5 and 6-year-olds who were killed in a classroom, all right? And what happened? Nothing. There was no big, massive rallies. There were no big marches. There was a lot of screaming and shouting and oh my Godism, but there was no real action. And so in a sense, what you have from Newtown to now is action. That's what's disrupted this process, is these young people have said, oh, you're not killing any more of us.
Well, part of it is who the victims were, right? I mean, you know, in Newtown, they're 5 and 6-year-olds. In Parkland, they're teenagers who have
Columbine,
access to, who have.
There were teenagers.
But Columbine also, it took the time, I think, between Columbine and now, with the changes in the ability to access social media, with their ability to organize independent of what the adults are doing. And so, you know, when I think back on King, I think, you know, in part, how we haven't realized that dream is also around accountability, and what these young people who you know, March for Our Lives are saying is that there is going to be real political accountability. We'll have to see how that comes into fruition.
And
but
that's what
King
I'm
was
saying.
also calling for accountability,
Right,
and I think I agree with you that there
where's the
isn't
accountability within the community
I think there
to the
isn't
people who
accountability with
represent our
leadership.
interests? Right.
There isn't accountability with Black leadership to our communities, and you know, some of that is up to us. But broader policy changes are not going to happen with, you know, 45 members of a congressional Black caucus, because that's not a majority.
Well, I'll disagree with that and move on. I think there's a way those 45 members can leverage.
I agree.
Can leverage. You were inside, so you remember that caucus.
Well, I mean,
can leverage that.
And there, I mean, at the founding, the CBC said, we don't have party, you know, we are concerned about Black interests, and to that point. I do want to talk, just draw the thread out on Parkland just a little bit more, and not just Parkland, but really Black Lives Matter that inspired Parkland, the reaction, and the role of social media, specifically recording deaths. And that's a tactic that I see coming very much from, King was very astute in the image he presented to America of protesters. It wasn't an accident that they were all in their Sunday best and sundresses and slacks and ties and behaving civilly. And then to see these people just wanting to be treated like citizens, dressed nicely, hit with fire hoses and German shepherds, communicated something not about the marchers, but about the response of the state. Similarly, to have iPhone video of Black men being shot, of Black women being killed, and then the Parkland students bringing that iPhone video from the classrooms onto Twitter changes the nation in a way that Columbine or Virginia Tech didn't. And so this is really a question about movements, but sort of the evolution. There's more social media, but movements are flatter now. We don't have a king-like figure for, not just for race, but on any you know, movement, whether it's Tea Party, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, you know, pro-gun control. So has movement, the idea, the philosophy of movements, the practice of movements in America changed fundamentally to where the King model is no longer the model? It's flatter, and it's more, you know, the leadership is sort of more disparate or more dispersed.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there was an intention to choose King as a leader. I mean, part of the way he presented himself, his oratorical skills, the fact that he was a virtual unknown in Montgomery, and so that was intentional. And I think, I remember after King died in the ensuing years, people have always been saying, well, where's our next Black leader?
Right.
You know, where's our next leader? And I think the evolution of movements is that, is this sort of flat leadership style. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's changed because we've changed. And I know it confounds the media sometimes because they can't find somebody who's just going to speak for everybody.
Right.
And young people in Black Lives Matter, I remember, you know, they said, and you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, if you will, specifically intended that there not be one leader. March for Our Lives, the Parkland students have intended that there not be one leader. And and they challenge the media sometimes in wanting to choose one. But I think that's kind of the evolution of a movement, and that's okay.
That's the Tea Party structure. I remember my first meeting, the Tea Party began to rise during my time as chairman, and I remember saying to my chief of staff, well, I'd like to meet with these folks because they caused a little bit of excitement out there. We want to get them in and talk to them. So we had a meeting, 50 people show up here in DC, and I walk into the conference room. And so I'm sort of thinking in that model of, okay, so who's representing this movement that's emerging around the country? And come to find out, they all were. And it was this idea that they were cells unto themselves. Right. And so the DC, Maryland, and Virginia Tea Party leaders were individual leaders. And if there was a level of cooperation they could have on a particular outing or event, they did that. Otherwise, they did their own thing. So I think that's exactly the model that's really kind of grown up out of that. Now, there's some real problems with that model. And this is a real danger for the Parkland students, because we've seen it now with Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, that when there is not some degree of form and structure, that as this thing nationalizes, because it will nationalize, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just, a backyard event that occurs in a confined space. To your point about the media, they're going to find that one person or that one group of people who are going to be able to speak to them, or they want to talk about this and reflect back what's going on here. So it is very helpful to have some voices. Again, it may not be one voice, but right. You've got to identify some key people that you can direct people to who are consistent in the messaging. Mm-hmm. Because what I saw happen with Black Lives Matter, not so much with Black Lives Matter, but certainly with Tea Party and certainly with Occupy Wall Street, which are two sides of the same coin, by the way, is that other interests began to infiltrate into the movement. Right. And they then became the voice and the image of what was going on. So the first time someone showed up with a Nazi sign at a Tea Party rally, all right, that began to plague everybody. The first time you saw in the tent villages from the Occupy movement, people arrested for committing crimes and acts of violence, that then became the image of the movement. And it began to take away from the underlying message about economic disparities, et cetera, constitutional disparities for the Tea Party types. So it does matter, and the way the young people seem to have done this, they have those voices that are out there right now, and we've seen Laura Ingraham actually tussle with one of those voices in recent days. And it'll be interesting to see whether they can hold that model as this thing grows and strengthens.
So the notion, though, of infiltrators and provocateurs is not a new one. It's one that King faced, that
Absolutely.
the civil rights
but
movement
he could push back as the single voice.
That is true, but they also had to, they were constantly on the lookout for who those provocateurs would be, so that they could either take them out them, and continue to claim their message and their movement.
This is NYU's Law School, NYU's Law School's Brennan Center for Justice program, and we're talking Martin Luther King with Donna Edwards and Michael Steele, I'm sorry. I'm Ted Johnson from the Brennan Center here in DC. And before we open it up to the audience for questions, I wanted to sort of talk about the Dream King that we like to reflect on, that became a slightly different person towards the latter part of his life. Is there even agreement anymore that King's dream is synonymous with the American dream or the promise for America? Or have we decided that this is the place where if you work hard, you get ahead, and if you don't, too bad for you? Where King had this he felt the government had a responsibility. He was a proponent of things like the guaranteed basic income. Government is supposed to help people reach a basic standard of living and then let talent sort of go from there. And we seem to be at a point where your merits are the only thing that matters because that's the king dream, that this colorblind society. So the question really is King's dream, we know it hasn't been realized, but is it even the same? Do we have the same realization of the dream as he did? Or have we so whitewashed the figure king that his dream is now something completely different from what he was espousing in the last, actually during the course of his life, but particularly in the last 5-6 years or so?
What a question. I mean, I still have to believe that this call for social justice is one that is relevant today. When I look at, a county where Michael and I live, where you have Black political leadership, but you still have significant economic divides between those who struggle the most and those who've made it. And that's in a Black community. And so, to me, the latter messages from Dr. King around the call for economic justice is what is rooted behind the call for $15 an hour minimum wage. It's rooted behind the call for health care access for all of us. It's rooted in the call of workplaces being places where men and women can succeed on equal levels. And so I do think the message is still relevant, even if it's massaged a little bit.
Right. That's one way to put it. Yeah. That's a tougher question, I think, in the sense that we've so idealized the man to the point of this mythical figure, and there's wonderful statue of him down in the mall, and every January 15th, everyone takes the day to commemorate and remember. So you have all of the mythification of King in that sense, and I think what gets lost is, to your point, Donna, what really is the dream about? My take on the speech is one of watching and listening and appreciating that at the moment, King was not so much talking to the throngs in front of him at the Lincoln Memorial, but he was talking to future generations. Mm-hmm. He was sort of handing that torch on, because he knew that struggle in 1963 and 64 and 65, that was going to be there. But later on, when my children, my grandchildren, for them that speech was sort of the clarion call to continue and pick up that torch for freedom and justice and the American dream. The American dream and King's dream are synonymous in many respects, in my view. They particularly, as we heard him speak about, I read somewhere, this idea of freedom of speech. I read somewhere about the idea of protest. I read somewhere. That to me is just a reminder and the connection to this ideal that we have about America. Right. That, I'm fighting the fight here, but I still believe in the ideal of what this country is supposed to be about. It still matters to me. I'm not anti-America. Right. I'm not against America. I'm not against this American dream. In fact, I want to realize that that's my dream. Right. And I think that is a very, very important part of this. It does, though, when you sort of bring it forward and you look at the election of Barack Obama. And I just remember a lot of folks at the time saying, well, geez, now we're in this post-racial America.
I never said that, just for the record.
I know you didn't. I know you didn't. There were some of us who were a little bit more realistic about the situation than a few others. But again, it was this sort of now we've reached the ideal, because we'd always talked about the prospects. Oh, could a black man ever get elected president?
Right.
So here we are. So now that we're here, this is a good space, right? No. It was very torturous for Barack Obama. It was very difficult for him to sort of straddle that space as the first black president. And I think it was very difficult for the country to realize that they had this sort of outsized hope on what this man would be and what he would represent, when in fact, he was a politician who was trying to complete a political agenda.
Right.
He wasn't there to complete Dr. King's dream so much as he was there to, hey, I believe in creating this kind of a healthcare system. I want to see this happen on taxes. And then a whole lot of folks became very disillusioned all of a sudden. And again, that's going in with eyes blinded as opposed to recognizing the work that still must be done.
Right. So for the audience, if you have questions, we have 2 microphones on either side of the seating section there. Please feel free to queue up there, state your name, and then a very brief question, which means there's a question mark at the end of with a very brief monologue. And so while they're queuing up, I'm curious, talking about the march in response to Parkland, Martin Luther King's granddaughter was one of the folks who got up to talk, 9 years old, and delivered a message, and she said, I have a dream that enough is enough. And so what is your take, not just on the state of race today, but the multiracial coalitions that are trying to be built around other movements like gun control, and how King's message has influenced sort of where we are today. Certainly, I think the last poll I saw was 70% of the nation thinks race relations are very bad right now, which is twice as much as it was before Barack Obama assumed the presidency. So with this feeling that race relations are becoming worse, but the visuals of young people of different races coming together for different issues, also understanding that there are still racial cleavages in some of these movements that haven't been completely smoothed over. I mean, would King be hopeful if he saw the coalitions forming today and sort of the state of race relations in America? Or would he feel like that we've sort of stagnated and haven't made much progress since he left us?
I think from
Stuff.
yeah, it's tough to sort of project that, but I think he would be. I think he'd be disappointed, but I think he'd also. I think he'd be disappointed in the sense that we haven't been realistic about it. We just haven't been realistic. I mean, the one thing about King was he was realistic about what was in front of him. He was realistic about what was going on in the country around race. Mm-hmm. And it sort of shocked the conscience of the American people. To going back to your point, the deliberate nature of how he stylized the protest. All right, you're going to put your Sunday best on, and yeah, you're going to get hosed when you go out there. And the image I want is you being hosed in your Sunday best. Because to the point, it says more about the person holding the hose than you getting hosed. Right. And understanding the dynamics of that. And I think after his death, just sort of the lack of continuing that struggle. Some gave up. Some felt, okay, this is as far as we can go. Some thought the dream had pretty much been achieved, as far as it could. And I think he probably would have been disappointed about that, because going back to some of the things you were saying, Donna, about some of these other issues that were still very much germinating, not just in the black community, but across the country, that impacted white folks in Appalachia just as much as it impacted black folks in Mississippi. Right. That we stopped dealing with those things and we moved on to other things. Mm-hmm. And we became complacent about race, which is my big pushback today. We're not honest about it. We turn a blind eye. So there's the polls that are showing that race relations are worse today than they were before Barack Obama. Yeah, objectively that's true, but my point is they're exactly the same.
Yeah, right.
is exactly the same.
We just feel differently.
It just feels different. It's now you're paying attention to it. Right. Before you were just kind of lulled in this belief that it's all good. I don't have to deal with it. Right. I don't have to deal with that. But trust me, I know as a young African American starting out in my legal career at Georgetown Law School, sitting there with a group of friends and having one of them look at me and go, "Well, how did you get here?" The same way you did. Right. And then continue the conversation by saying, "Well, I had a friend who didn't get into school," implying that I took his seat. And my response was, "I guess he wasn't smart enough." All right? So it's still there.
Right.
It's still there. And we just stopped paying attention to it and recognizing, I think he would be disappointed about that.
I think if we take from Dr. King's message that we were somehow supposed to be colorblind, it's the wrong lesson.
It's the wrong message.
And the wrong message.
Yeah,
and I think, he did say that it was a long arc that bent toward justice, so it's not a small one. And I think that were he alive today, one, I could see him out there with John Lewis with the young people marching for our lives. I could see him with Black Lives Matter. I could see him supporting the organizing that's going on right now, even if they choose to use different or modified strategies and tactics. But I guess I've just never, I've been, in the rooms as the one and the only, and I don't think that Dr. King believed that we should be, rested in being the one and the only. If we're not bringing others along.
Yep.
That hasn't changed.
Yes.
Hi. My question is actually, do you feel that maybe the structure of the movements have happened to be more flat instead of with one or a few main leaders because people do not want to risk maybe the consequences of being that one leader? And then second, Michael Steele, I know you had mentioned that there were things that could have been done politically to uplift the Black community. What are those things? Because I saw you disagree with Donna Edwards there. So those are my two questions.
Yeah, have we created an environment where no one wants to lead anymore? Because the invasions of privacy, the penalties of being the leader, the targeting that happens, is it now like it's unattractive?
Yeah, I guess in many respects it is. The lack of privacy, the intrusion into your life, as we just saw play out with Laura Ingraham, where she's going after a 17-year-old because he didn't make it into college. Right. I mean, really, this is what it is. So, that's a tactic, though. That's it's all a tactic to disrupt and to delegitimize the individual and the effort. What it calls for is folks who are willing to stand in that crucible, stand in that courtyard of public opinion, and just come what may. Yes, social media makes that much harder to do, but remember this: typically, the person that's out there talking smack about you on Twitter, check the number of followers they have. They're usually somewhere like just recently. Someone was dogging me about something I said, and I looked at the phone, like 18 people.
All Russians.
So what they're counting on is all Russians, right?
That sounds like a bot to me.
Yeah, they're counting on me to respond back through my Twitter network to elevate their platform and their argument. And that's why I rarely respond. I rarely play the game because I've been on that side way too long and know how it's played. And the social media today is no different than dealing with the Washington Post 15 years ago or dealing with, anything else before that.
See, to my way of thinking, this idea of a flat leadership structure, I think it's a really interesting new model because it allows you to unite voices from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the North to the South in a way that we couldn't do before. And so I don't have a problem with that kind of leadership structure because, if you think about it, if there were not flat leadership a couple of weeks ago in organizing for March 24th, How in the world could you have 800 different marches taking place all across the United States and around the world? That would have been
I'm not begrudging the flat leadership. I think that's
an
fine.
impossibility. And so I just think of that as an evolution, recognizing our current media structure in the same ways that Dr. King recognized and took advantage of the media structure that was existent in the 1950s and 60s. He used that to great advantage. That was what was available, and this is available to new movements. And I think that there was a question about your right.
Yeah, no,
A little your policy
Right.
program.
well, no, what sticks in my craw a lot is having served as Lieutenant Governor of Maryland and having worked with a cross-section of black political leaders, not just in my state, but across the country. I think a lot of my frustration is born out of sort of a paraphrasing of Janet Jackson's "What Have You Done For Me Lately?" It's "What have you done for us lately?" And I've always believed, whether I was battling to reform our economic enterprise system to the benefit of minority and women-owned businesses in the state, or taking a lot of crap from black elected officials because I was exposing what was going on in Baltimore City Public Schools and the fact that they were not structures for learning, but really hellish holes for a lot of kids, where they didn't have resources, they didn't have the kinds of things that they needed at the time. That to me was a very frustrating experience. And when I take that and I look at it more broadly, and I see the reaction that people have, I kind of conclude that, you know, the expectation that white folks are going to come in and solve the problems in our community is just boneheadedly stupid. We need to get over that, because there ain't a white man on this planet that's going to solve what's going on in my neighborhood, in my community. That has to start with me. That's why I look at someone who's now running for county executive in my county, and I go, what have you done for us lately? She has a record that I can then look at and go, okay, that makes sense. But that's not the case, and it's not a consistent action. And so when you look at the school systems, so you look at the lack of economic opportunity, you look at the redlining of neighborhoods and communities, you look at the response writ large, I'm not looking to white people to solve that. I'm not. I have to take charge of that. And so at what point do we as a community say, enough? I'm not taking my kid to this school anymore, all right? I'm going to replace the school board. I'm going to hold accountable those elected officials who, for election after election cycle, tells me, "Oh, we got this. We're going to solve this problem." Well, you've been solving this problem since I was in kindergarten. And so, at some point, you have to say enough, and that starts with us. I think it doesn't start with anyone outside the community coming in with some grand master plan that's going to help create prosperity. And that's, again, looking back at programs that Jack Kemp and others were promoting. That's great. Let me take that and see if I can make it work for me. But I'm not going to rely on you to do it, because going back to that idea of a rising tide lifts all boats, I got to have a boat first. And so I learned from the Bible how to build an ark. All right. So that's what I got to do for my community and for my family. And I think that's one of the big steps that needs to be taken in my view.
Well, I mean, and here's where Michael and I really do agree on the accountability for black political leadership. Because in some places, whether they are urban communities where you have virtually all black leadership, in some districts in the Congress where you represent a majority black population, there has to be an accountability for that leadership to our communities. And I think that line in some places has been broken. And the way to restore it, when I think back on Dr. King, the way to restore it is for us to have our movements rooted in justice, in democracy, in the Constitution, and hold our political leadership accountable or get rid of them because they're not serving our communities. And that actually doesn't have anything to do with broader national policies, even though I think that there are broader national public policy changes that we can make. In my county or in Baltimore City, where Michael was talking about, the leadership are almost all Black political leadership. And so then what becomes the excuses in those places for us not having schools that are educating and graduating students, for there to be some of the most tremendous disparities when it comes to healthcare, heart disease, kidney disease, sexually transmitted infections, diabetes, infant and child mortality, in places where you have, a growing Black middle class and upper middle class, but you have these deep sections of poverty. And, to Michael's point, at some point or other, that's on us to solve some of these problems in our community, even though we should still be fighting for broader public policy changes that happen on the national level.
Hi, my name is Christian Hossam. Thank you very much for your panel and for your thoughts. In the time since Dr. King's assassination, I think it might be prescient to say that we moved maybe from a civil rights agenda to a racial justice agenda, like in terms of just how we think about these things as a framework. And yet in that time, we also kind of have much more polarization, much more kind of party factionalism. I mean, you're both representing the Democratic and the Republican Party, so I'm wondering if you guys can talk about maybe the interplay between racism and polarization in terms of maybe making it very difficult to achieve a kind of a racial justice agenda kind of in the contemporary moment. Because even if you look back at the moment that King is kind of at his prime, the pushing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are bipartisan. And they're passed by both chambers. And right now, it seems that anything that would happen in terms of any kind of legislation would really be championed and marched by one party over the other. And so how do we kind of deal with kind of racial justice and civil rights in this moment when we understand that it's pretty much often one party that's going to do that, even if any party that does it is still going to have its own kind of flaws, sometimes fundamental.
Well, let's be clear, maybe neither Michael nor I are actually speaking for the Republican or the Democratic Party for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. And they took my mic, so I don't have the microphone anymore.
On the other hand, though, I do think that there are places where we should see some linkages between economic justice and racial justice or injustice. And our political leadership should require that. And I think that there are a number of things that can be done on a bipartisan basis in the Congress, from my experience, but that are held up because of the deep divides. And I don't know that that really serves Black communities. I don't know that it serves immigrant communities. I don't know that it serves poor people. And we shouldn't underscore or discount, rather, the importance of the leadership in the White House contributing to the polarization that we're experiencing right now. Not that it wasn't polarized before, certainly in the Congress, but who sits in the White House contributes a lot to what the national conversation is.
That's true. I just say real quickly, one party gives lip service, the other party doesn't care. That's where we are, and that's the truth of it. The lip service is, I can say the right things, make you believe that this is where we're going to go and this is what we're going to do, but the end result is inaction.
Well, I don't think that we should be giving over our votes to people who aren't going to really work for us.
That's true, but that's what we do. Because the truth of the matter is, this September, despite what people are thinking and projecting and what may or may not be, the truth of the matter is a significant number of members of Congress are going to get reelected. And they're going to get reelected by the very same people who are bitching and moaning about the state of things right now. So at some point you have to say to yourself, either I shut up or I put up. Either I don't like what you're doing and I vote you out, or I'm just going to be quiet about it. And so the political parties rely on that at the end of the day. They rely on that level of abstinence, disengagement, just sort of reconciling yourself to the way it always is. One of the things that I learned very quickly as I went and started, rearranging the furniture inside the RNC was a whole lot of people liked that table where it was. A whole lot of people liked that chair in that corner. And despite the idea of having, a black man running the party, they liked the idea. The reality of it was something they were not ready to put up with. And that is no different on the Democratic Party. How many times has Donna Brazile been the bridesmaid and never the bride? For the DNC. I mean, every time they get in some hot water, they go call her, but they don't give her the power and the authority to actually run the place and do it. So again, lip service to placate, lip service to medicate, and the other party just doesn't give a damn. Okay, because my vote is these pissed off white folks over here. I'm not worried about all y'all doing your Black Lives Matter thing over there until it matters.
Right.
And it will matter a lot sooner than both parties realize.
Yeah, and we saw like Thad Cochran in Mississippi.
Absolutely.
He turned to black voters in the Republican primary to rescue him.
But can I speak to that and why that was important? Because Thad Cochran, I worked with Thad and knew him well. He had always been consistent and always been genuine. He'd always been engaged in the black community. That's why it was easy for the black community to stand with him in that moment. And it was not a political peril for them.
Right.
Because Thad Cochran had been in the community, had listened, had taken their request and legislation to his job in the Senate. So I used Thad Cochran as much, and you saw what happened. A lot of people in the party just trashed him and went after him in that moment because they wanted to take him out. They didn't believe that black vote was going to be there, da-da-da-da-da. The fact of the matter is, as I said to a lot of folks, that's the example you want. Someone who's willing to go and put it on the line and listen and take the incoming, take the risks, because there will come a point where you will need that community. And if you have, again, Janet Jackson can answer the question, what have you done for me lately? They'll be there. Republican Party can't answer that question favorably, I think, right now, and that's going to be a problem.
Well, and I do think the challenge for Democrats is we know that the overwhelming majority of black folk vote for Democrats. And I do think that we have to start demanding something in exchange for our vote. That the work, and we have to realize that the work doesn't end on Election Day. That's actually just the beginning of the work.
Yeah.
And certainly this is going to be true for the midterm elections in 2018, where turnout is going to be really important. And I believe that because of who sits in the White House, that there is going to be really strong turnout. We've already seen that in some of these special elections that have taken place. But my question is not what happens in November on that Tuesday. It's what happens on Wednesday. And whether we enable ourselves to realize our own dreams by holding our elected officials accountable.
Yes.
Hi, Dan Wiener. I'm from the Brennan Center. I'm struck by the debates you have had about representation, and I'm wondering, there is a preoccupation in our political system with sort of nose counting for African Americans in power and also for women and other groups. What does it take to be able to say that a community is adequately represented or well represented in our political system? Because it's something we at the Brennan Center spent a lot of time thinking about, and I'm not sure we totally know the answer.
Well, I'll just say this, as a woman, when you have a Congress with 535 elected representatives, not counting the representatives for the various territories in the District of Columbia, that 19.4% is not enough. As a black woman, when you have 1% of the United States Senate, it's not enough. And so I don't know what the threshold is, I just know what's not enough. And when you look at state legislatures across the country, you can begin to make the same kinds of, ask the same kinds of questions. I know Michael and I have had some agreements when it comes to things like redrawing lines. And we're coming up on a midterm election that's actually going to decide the state legislatures that are going to redraw the lines after the next census. I would like to see us pay more attention to things like communities of interest and making sure that we're not splitting up black and brown communities in order to consolidate power continually in majority hands. I think this is a really important question as we come up. And so I can't tell you what the threshold would be or should be for groups and interests that are not represented, particularly in the Congress. But I know that what we have right now is not enough. And if it were composed differently, we would be having a very different conversation about major issues of public policy.
What she said.
Yeah, and from an academic perspective, the research shows that politicians tend to be more responsive to economic elites and business interests than to the average citizen. Some of it is because those with resources have the resources for staying power. And the average citizen has a job to go to, bills to pay, a family to take care of, and can't be on top of what folks are doing day in and out. But it's a tough problem. And certainly the polarization of the parties doesn't help.
Right.
And having a captured electorate like black folks is also unhelpful. Yes?
My name is Richard Bannock. I'm a college student. My question is, I don't know how to phrase this properly. So both of you, I think it's fair to say, are successful public figures. And I'm just wondering, as a when you're a public figure, how do you expand your influence and your message? So right now, I'm the presumptive nominee for my party for county council in my district, and I'm the only candidate talking about education reform, quelling the achievement gap, expanding equality of opportunity for everyone. Yet, I'm also a Republican. And I think of myself as part of a new coalition within the Republican Party in reaction to the election of President Trump. Sorry, to go back to my question is, how do I get past the R in front of my name and promote my message? Yeah.
That's a real...
Feel your brother?
I'm gonna let Michael take that one.
Oh my God.
This is gonna be a new club for you all.
Yeah, I'll give you my card afterwards.
I appreciate that.
So the truth of the matter is it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. It just is. I ran for the United States Senate in Maryland in 2006.
Hard.
And it was a very difficult campaign because at that time I named it, I was wearing the scarlet R because it didn't matter so much what I had achieved and the things that we had done to benefit Marylanders and the community as a whole. I was a Republican. And so it becomes a very difficult thing to do. Having said that, I think it's important that regardless of anything else, just stay true to who you are. If you are authentic, voters have a really good nose for bullshit. And despite their seemingly complacency, sometimes at the ballot box, re-electing the same idiots over and over again, all right? There is a greater awareness now since about 2009, 2010, that voters are willing to get their hands dirty in the political process. And one way they do that is sort of ferreting out the kinds of leaders, going back to your point about accountability and representation, the kinds of leaders they want. So if you're the only candidate talking about what matters to those voters, that R should not matter in the long run. And I'll give you a good example and model to follow. The state of Virginia, the election last November, the election of the transgendered female who ran against a gentleman in a very red district in Virginia. Red, I mean red, okay? He ran against her sexual orientation and her lifestyle. She ran about,
Transportation.
can we fix the roads here? Can we get a better transportation plan than the one we have? Because I had a lot of potholes and the bus don't come through here and we need a stoplight there. She ran on bread and butter stuff that people in that very red conservative district wanted to be done, that the current leadership had failed to do. He was scaremongering over the fact that she was transgendered, scaremongering on the fact that she had this type of relationship or that type of relationship. She spoke to the people about the fact that I need you to get to work on time because you want to get to work on time. She won in a very red district. So the point is, if you are real and authentic about what you are going to do and you're honest about that and you're not afraid to be held accountable for that, that will resonate with those voters. You don't need to play up the R, you don't need to play down the R. Just play who you are, just be who you are and lay your agenda out there. You should never be afraid to stand on what you're willing to run on. You should never be afraid. That's what when I go back and I look at Mitt Romney's race, I'm like, dude, you did Romney care in Massachusetts. Why are you running away from that? Voters look at that and they go, well, you're not real. You're not, if you know, you won't even brag on the stuff that you did that the people in your state liked. What the hell are you going to do for me? Right? Had nothing to do with being a Republican. Had nothing to do with Obamacare. They looked at what he did as a governor and said, okay, tell me about that. He was like, oh, I don't know what that was. That just happened. I just happened to be there. People were like, okay, yeah, all right, whatever.
Well, at some point or other, the Republican Party is going to have to find itself. And,
oh, well, that's a whole different conversation.
That's
a whole lot of drinking and a whole lot
right, of... Right, but the way it's related
but this is
that it would be a
where the
fairer
Republican Party
That's
is.
right, but it would be a fairer fight, I think, even for Democrats, for the Republican Party to find itself outside of the age of the person who's sitting in the White House right now.
Well, don't worry, your term is coming. Don't worry. You still have been, Bernie Sanders and others to deal with.
Not me.
But that's the only thing you can do, because you can't navigate around all the other stuff. That's all bright shining objects, rabbit hole stuff. How do you feel you're doing in your race?
I'm going to win the primary because I'm unopposed.
That helps.
I don't have to deal with a Tea Party.
But how do you feel about what happens in the general?
I went to a candidate forum and I saw my opponents and I debated with them, which is kind of interesting considering there's 8 Democrats and
Not
I
on the
debated with them.
microphone.
Oh, sorry.
All right.
It depends on who wins in the Democratic race because development is a big issue in Montgomery County.
All right.
And for example, I think if Meredith Wellington wins, I'm just going to say she should win because she knows everything way better than I do. But
Well, first off, don't do that.
I mean, I'm just going to be honest. Like I'm 20.
But
there are people who are Democrats in that race who, if they win, I will take this incredibly seriously because I look at them as destructive to our county and their voting records and their opinions on certain issues, and their lack of care of like certain groups in our community is troubling to me.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, democracy is great because, like, let 1,000 flowers bloom.
That's right.
But yeah, thank you for answering.
Knock it out of the park, buddy.
Rachel.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. My name is Rachel Levinson Waldman. I'm also with the Brennan Center, a colleague of Ted's. I just had a quick question. One of the things that we were talking about, I think Representative Edwards was especially speaking to, but everyone was this idea, this sort of new idea of like a flat leadership structure. I think that was one of the questions. And the idea that it's kind of enabled, all of these different voices to come together. One of the kind of downsides that's been talked about in terms of a flat leadership structure, Zeynep Tufekci has written about this, the idea that it allows movements to, amazing movements to be started, movements that in some ways might not happen otherwise, but also where the leaders and the participants haven't put in the time together face to face to build trust, to go through challenges, to really kind of negotiate together. So the social media really has allowed people to come together and do a lot of advocacy together, but also isn't necessarily built on the foundation that movements were. So it seems like that's one of the things we're seeing right now with Parkland, for instance, is that both that they're able to take advantage of all of these tools of communication, but also that they know each other, right? They're actually going home to the same place. But so I'm curious really for all of you, how much you think that actually is a downside? Do you think that's a real issue, or is that something that, you know, is sort of going to get worked out, kind of that potential, you know, con of so much happening in a virtual space?
You know, it's what an interesting question, because I think if you look at the weeks leading up to the March for Our Lives, that in fact the students, young people from Chicago, and representing elements of Black Lives Matter and others in Chicago actually met with the students at Parkland. That became part of the planning process for the March 24th march. And so I think, you know, the traditional building trust and things like that, where you build movements, is really important. But they're also figuring out other ways that they can communicate with each other internally that help to build trust as well. I mean, you have to be really careful what you write in an email to somebody else, because you have to think about how they hear it on the other end. And I think this generation is actually capable of bridging those hurdles, where they are able to have conversations with each other that are different from my generation, where a conversation is about the two of us being together in the same room. And I think this is going to be an evolution in their movement and their organizing.
I think it boils down to the divide and conquer strategy that the media and other elements out there play on a continual basis. You know, it is how they rally around one when he or she is under attack by many. As how they do what you're saying in terms of that communication. That's going to be the future test in the short term for Parkland and even some of the other movements out there that may be re-energizing themselves and getting back in the game a little bit more. You know, there's a lot to be said for the flat leadership approach. Seen it firsthand, know it well and know it intimately, but I also know it's much easier to destroy from within, because there is no within. You know, there's no center mass. It's all there, and so I can pick her and focus everything to her with all these other potential leaders who are in the movement and doing everything else. And what does that do? That stimulates jealousies. It stimulates territory. Why are you just talking to her? You know, we're part of this too. Da da da. All of that comes into play, and you avoid a lot of that. Going back to the King example, by knocking it down when you see the potential for it, and reinforcing the unit of support within the community that you're in through some form of leadership structure. I think at the end of the day, you're going to need some degree of leadership structure to stave off the incoming.
One last question, and in responding to her question, sort of any final thoughts that you have on the discussion today.
Hi, my name is Jamie Hinan Wong. I just had a question, or in general, I'd love to hear your thoughts about whenever I listen to MLK's speech on Vietnam. It brings to me the idea of state violence, him looking at it not only internally but also externally, where he was evaluating how can I, as you mentioned before, address domestic violence without addressing the violence that the state is enacting on other people in other countries who are in very similar poverty conditions. So I was just wondering about your thoughts on how we grapple with that today and how we're continuing in the face of some things that come to mind. And a positive example I would think of is Black Lives Matter and their involvement with Palestine, and how we sort of trying to take this global approach to liberation and also addressing global colonialism, those concepts, while also looking at the state violence that the U.S. continues to do today. Especially an example that comes to mind to me would be drone attacks under the Obama administration, and of course violence that continues to this day too. Sort of how do we address that in a way that brings together all of your experience and thoughts.
And that Vietnam speech at Riverside, Dr. King talked about the linkages between what was happening in some African nations, particularly in Ghana, and what was going on in the streets in Washington, D.C. I mean, I remember when he said, it said something about having received the Nobel Peace Prize, that he could not, in good faith, wear that mantle without connecting our domestic situation to what was going on internationally. He was an internationalist. And I don't think we often think about him in that way. And I think it's incumbent on us to remember that there is a connection between how we handle ourselves in our own state, in our own country, and the way that the United States either acts or is perceived to act in other countries. And it's tough. I think as a former elected official, I can tell you that when people want you to be concerned about, potholes and home foreclosures, but you also have to wear this, sort of additional piece of being concerned about what happens around the world. And sometimes it can be difficult as a policymaker to make those connections.
Yeah, I think real quick that's a conundrum for elected officials for sure. I think there has to be sort of a re-education of the American people on this front, in the sense that they feel, at least in my travels and talking to a lot of people, and one of the appeals of President Trump, quite honestly, is the sort of nationalist perspective on things. We're going to take care of home. We've taken care of everybody else. We're not doing that anymore, And if you want to play, then you're going to have to pay, because we're not paying your way, From the UN to individual nation states, we're just not. So the American people are in a space where they like, to a large degree, this level of isolationism. They are concerned about the lack of jobs at home, which is why, the Trans-Pacific Partnership in NAFTA, other trade deals and arrangements become easy targets, because you can relate them back, even though the facts bear out something very differently. They can relate it back that you lost your job in the factory because that NAFTA agreement, and they took that job to Canada, they took that job to Mexico. So after years and years of that, along with a lot of other things, the idea that you're going to come in with this global perspective, this internationalist perspective, which is why Steve Bannon and others so pejoritized the term, and were able to do so fairly easily, makes it a very hard argument to a significant portion of the American population that we need to be concerned about what's happening in Yemen, which is now, 22 million people living in some of the most horrific conditions on the planet at the moment. I dare say if you go out and poll the American people, like, no, I'm not interested in that. And they would give their elected officials a hard time if they express the expenditure of resources, et cetera, to deal with that. And that's largely going back to the point you made about what happens from the top. The president's messaging on this plays very much into that and reinforces that sentiment, that feeling, that we don't need to go play in that backyard anymore.
Well, our thanks to Donna Edwards and Michael Steele for speaking about Dr. King, his legacy on the 50th anniversary of his passing. I'm Ted Johnson, and on behalf of the Brennan Center for Justice team, we are particularly grateful for our partnership with the New York University's John Verdemas Center and NYU Washington, D.C. campus that makes these programs possible. Please keep up with the Brennan Center's work online at brennancenter.org. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Watch our videos on YouTube and listen to our podcast. Thanks so much, and thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.